I'll start again. Good evening, everyone. Carol Rafferty of the Yale Center, Beijing, wanted to warmly welcome all of you, and she regrets that she cannot be here in person, but she asked me to extend a very warm welcome to everyone and to thank our speaker, Professor Deborah Davis. I also want to thank Carol's team here at YCB for this lovely venue and for having enough room to accommodate everyone. I think we're going to have a totally full house here, which is great. We had to move from the other room over here because the reception has been so wonderful. And also to the Yale Club members among you. It's a great reception and we really appreciate it. Come on in. There's still some seats. To many of you, Professor Davis needs no introduction. She's first I should say, probably I do need an introduction because many of you don't know me. So my name is Melinda Liu. I'm the vice president of RASBJ, which is co-organizing the event today, an old friend of Deb and a great admirer of hers. Now, she doesn't need that much of an introduction because she is very well known in the Yale community. She is the professor emerita of sociology at Yale, where she served as director of academic programs at the Yale Center for Study of Globalization. That she is the chair of the Department of Sociology, the chair of the Council on East Asian Studies, and the co-chair of the Women's Faculty Forum. She's currently a visiting faculty member at Schwarzman College and an honorary professor at Fudan University. Specific to tonight's topic, the future of marriage in China, her most recent book, co-edited with Sarah Friedman, is entitled Wives, Husbands, and Lovers. And a recent article related to tonight's talk is We Do, Parental Involvement in the Marriages of Urban Sons and Daughters. I know that just about everybody here has to have had marriage on their mind at one moment or another, whether to get married or whether you can get away with not getting married, whether your parents are trying to get you married, or indeed whether your parents don't mind if you don't get married, or how long you're going to be married, or how many times you're going to be married, or even how not to be married if you are married. All of us have had this issue on our minds, and tonight Deborah is going to enthrall us with the extent of her knowledge and also bring up a lot of surprising things that we don't already know. Deborah, over to you.
Melinda didn't say enough about herself. Do you want to say what you've done in Beijing?
The main thing I've done here is I've just been here for a really long time, and I'm really an old timer. I'm the Beijing bureau chief for Newsweek magazine, and my husband and I work on the Royal Asiatic Society Beijing, and we try to be a sort of a bridge through history and culture of Asia between East and West. And we're so glad to have some fantastic speakers like Deb who can navigate that journey very well and with great expertise.
Thank you. I want to tone down the expectations. This is not the definitive talk on this topic. This is actually a conversation. I was told that this will be an opportunity for me to learn from people who know much more than I about this subject. So what I'm going to do, as I think was the overview already, is I am going to make an academic overview, which presents some of the questions, and then I hope we will have time for the Q&A. So could you remind me of the time frame so I can look at the clock? Okay, so I will go through the slides quite quickly. So I'll try to be finished by 6:35, 6:40 latest. Okay, fortunately there's a clock, and those of you who've been to university know that you turn them on and they can talk for 10 minutes or 20 minutes or 45 minutes, and I'm of that school. When Melinda was deciding how to promote this for this group of this dual audience here, she added this, I do, and that's fine with me. You'll see I certainly return to that, but it's not really the way I shaped the talk. Okay, we start here with a picture of an event in the summer. How many people saw this on the news? Anybody? Yes, few. Okay. So I was thinking I have to give a series of lectures for the Schwartzman students, and marriage and divorce was on the agenda. And so I'm looking for visuals. And this sets up the question that runs in the class, but also tonight, is we know that the Chinese government has decided that it really wants to shape the institution of marriage. If you looked at this article I wrote 10 years ago on privatization of marriage, if we turn back the clock, at that point, really from the mid-'80s onward, the Chinese government stepped back from managing marriage. They didn't step back from managing fertility, but they did step back from managing marriage. And I'll highlight some of the consequences of that retreat from state supervision and politicization. Now there's a new administration, a new set of priorities, and in this picture, we capture, I think, some of the goals. So here we are in a very, very wealthy part of China, and it's a group marriage, and it's being promoted to save money, to take parents out of the marriage equation, and hopefully stabilize marriage. This is the goal. And then the other more recent state council piece is on the fertility piece. So today I'm going to talk about both these trends in marriage and childbearing, which clearly are linked. Okay, so here is the story. China became one of the easiest and cheapest places in the world to get a divorce. This comes as a shock to many people. I don't know if I have a pointer. Do I have a pointer as well? Yes, this is probably a pointer. Let's see. Is this a pointer? No. Okay. No pointer. You can see this diagram, which I created. It starts in 1978. If we had gone back further, you would have seen almost no divorce from the time the marriage law stops being implemented around 1953. It's almost impossible to get a divorce. The new marriage law changes the terms and loosens the constraints. And at the same time, you have a surge of people who had delayed their marriage. So if we start at that 1980, for every 23 marriages, there's one divorce. But as we move across, you'll see that ratio widens, so that by the time you get to 220, it's 2 marriages for every divorce, one of the highest rates in the world. It's also one of the cheapest places to get a divorce. As you know, you don't need to go to court. It's quite extraordinary. Thank you very much. He's all set. So this is challenge number 1 to the state. What are they going to do with this divorce pattern? And they have, as you know, made it harder to get a divorce, somewhat delayed. And in this last quarter, going through 2024, the ratio now is 2.4 marriages to 1 divorce. But we captured the issue. The state would like to stabilize marriage. It would like to reduce the number of divorces. It would like to make marriages more secure. And what I will be talking about and listening to your reflections is that I think this is very, very hard to do. The conditions which make divorce necessary, a choice, I think will continue, and I don't see any evidence that the state is really going to make it that much more difficult. So that's the big story. The other piece is the parents that Melinda mentioned at the beginning. Our parents as deeply involved, and the change that I saw before COVID and then after COVID, last year it's really struck me, was that parents were less anxious. Now, this picture was taken in 2015 when I was working on the Marriage Corner in Shanghai, and that's one of the articles that relates to this, called Reinstating the Family This is looking at who marries whom, who relies on parents to find a spouse. And what we found from not this picture, but from a survey of a random sample of everyone in Shanghai born between 1980 and 1989. It's a fantastic survey, and about 40% are YD people. So we were really able to look at what it means to be native and non-native in the city of Shanghai. And most people who married did so by finding their spouse themselves, majority, but almost 20% relied on their parents or a close relative. So my task was to figure out, do men behave differently than women? Are men and parents of men involved in this marriage search in a different way than the parents and of the women? Hanging out, I went to the marriage corner for 18 weeks, and I would circulate around. I would talk to people. I had a minimum of an hour, and afterwards we did a structured set of interviews with students. Because what I observed was that when fathers were looking for sons, the unmarried son, they were angry. They were angry at their son. And when mothers were looking for their daughters, they were mainly guilty. I don't mean this as they filled out a form. I'm talking about, the sense that when you're talking, that fathers, as they were talking, could start very calmly. And then as the conversation, they became quite agitated, and I called it angry. It doesn't, that's on that end of the spectrum. And that was what I was interested in. So when we went back to look at the terrific data we had, we did indeed find a statistically significant variation, controlling for all other variables. And that was men who relied on their parents were significantly more likely to have a father who was a party member. Women who relied on their parents were significantly likely to have a Shanghai hukou. Right. So the way we interpret it, which holds up, I think, in different ways, is that the men who had not found a spouse on their own and were relying on their parents were also drawing on their parents' political capital and political position. Whereas the women who had not yet found a spouse and whose parents were involved, the key concern of the parents was that the hukou match. The Shanghai parents wanted to be sure their daughter had a Shanghai man. They did not want to have, and this is when you control for all else. And those of you who do statistics means we're talking about a probability. There's not a straight linear line, but it fits. That a man who doesn't find a spouse on his own is more reliant on their parents, and parents who have more assets. And it's not the economic asset necessarily, but a political connection. This is something that's useful in this marriage search. And in the women, it's this anxiety that their daughter will marry someone who is not Shanghainese. And this is what they're looking for, is a kind of matching of the doors for themselves. And that was the basic takeaway from when I last went to the corner, which was 2019. And I was walking around, and afterwards I stopped to meet some men who were just talking to each other. They weren't at the marriage corner. And we talked about what was going on. And I told them, I think what's happening is the parents are circulating, especially the more affluent ones, around the edges of the park, trying to find a family that looked like them, matching of doors. And the two men said, absolutely. This is why they don't do it online. This is why they're not doing it with an indirect in between. They want to go and they want to see and they want to make sure that the doors match. So I think the tradition of parents playing this key role in matchmaking, which is matching the families, is deeply rooted in many ways, and it certainly has not been extinguished. But what I am suggesting is that for the current group of unmarried persons, parents are moving more to the edge, and parents themselves are reassessing the centrality of marriage, because we have a new generation of parents who themselves may have either been through a divorce or they have seen other marital situations which are unacceptable. So it's no longer parents feeling there's only one path, and without marrying, you're abnormal. And I started in 2014, 2015. That would be the most common things. These people are abnormal, and this is necessary. My child is not abnormal. And what I'm hearing, and I can hear more from this audience is I think there's a shift because we're dealing with a different group of parents. We're dealing with parents who themselves, were parents of the only child who themselves matured in the 1980s. This is not the parents of the 1960s or 1970s. So got too many pieces here. So that's the marriage corner. The other piece of the research that I did in this period was about weddings. And again, people would say, weddings, how trivial. I had done an earlier book which was called The Consumer Revolution, in which we spent a lot of times in department stores and malls, which I don't even do in the United States. And again, people said, why are you wasting your time in a mall? Similarly here, people say, what? Why are you wasting your time in marriage halls? Why are you interviewing people in the marriage industry? Why are you interviewing people and watching their marriage videos? And there are many reasons. One is that as a foreign scholar, even in 2019, you had to be 2017, 2019, not all topics are available to you. And so you do strategize to find a location where you as the foreigner can listen. And whereas you as a foreigner might see things that the official record is not reporting back to you. And weddings was precisely that location. And it was also a place, because it's a happy event, in which people welcomed me into the weddings. They welcomed me into their homes. And for an outside researcher, this is a gold mine. I mean, this is where we want to be, where we are there to listen and people willingly want to share their views without censorship. So this is a picture of those of you who, many of this have been to many weddings. This is not a wedding I attended. So this is from a website from a wedding industry picture. So I wouldn't use it in a publication, but I can use it in a PowerPoint. And you can see what the heading of the article I wrote from this, performing happiness for self and others. That's what we were probing. What's the meaning of Shinfu? What's the meaning of happiness? And within the wedding setting, wedding performance, it was very clear that how both generations were invested in making this happy event a good performance. And it was for the parents. Most of the young people that I interviewed or had conversations with would have preferred a destination wedding, but destination weddings were not acceptable to their parents. So the wedding is very much a celebration of the family. It's a demonstration that they are good parents. I'm now going to flag a few other places where I think that the state's agenda is going to run into problems. And the first is on this question of fidelity and the importance of sexual intimacy outside of marriage, premarital, extramarital, and same sex. I'm going to be talking only about the first. So this is from Pan Sui-min, who some of you may know is a Renda professor, and he's written a very famous book. This is from his an article that was originally in 2017, but it surfaced last summer as I was thinking about not this lecture, which I didn't know I was going to give, but the lecture I was going to give at Schwartzman. And it's very shocking to people in Hong Kong to see this. It is very shocking to most people in the United States that over this relatively short period from 2000 to 2015, the level of going off the tracks, being unfaithful to your partner is so widely acknowledged in China. This is asking people, have you gone off the tracks? So these are people who said yes to when they were surveyed. So one assumes the rate could be higher, that there's the lower boundary. And not surprisingly, the male rate, which is the blue line, is higher than the female, which is the yellow. And then the red is both partners, both sides report it. And the other piece, which for the Chinese audience, I think is particularly appropriate, is how do people react to infidelity based on their year of birth? So here you can see, you all don't have to walk through. I think the born after 2000 is a less, they're less numerous. So, but really what we're looking at are the older generation So here are people born, sorry, before 1960. You can, why is this thing not working? Ay, 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 ay. Can we find it? No. Do we see it? Should be here, right? Okay, it's not working. It's okay. It's okay. Well, it did before, but it's not now. So anyway, I'll just use, we'll use old fashioned, really old fashioned. This is great. This is great. So this, when we're talking about this gap between the parents and the younger ones, so these are people born before 1960, and then let's focus on the ones 1970, those are the current ones, and this younger generation here. So these people are about 30 years old. And the first one, what do you do if you discover your partner is unfaithful? Nothing. Right? This is, and we watch how this is radically changed so that the younger group is really going to make it public. Here, they will immediately ask to break up, have a divorce. Again, this is the younger group. On one hand, in other words, we're seeing actually high levels of infidelity to a partner. And at the same time, the response is, I will break up. I'm not doing research on this, and I'm not going to talk about how this compares to other countries because I don't have that information. But it's a dynamic that I'm thinking about. On one hand, the marriages are fragile. People are more willing to divorce. Divorce is less stigmatized. Parents are putting less pressure on young adults to marry. And yet, these same, if this is capturing what's happening, they also are quick to call things off. So actually that's fueling the other instability. So there's different things going on. So the rules for sexual intimacy and for partnerships have radically changed, but there's something else going on in terms of how people who are more likely to be seemingly casual are quicker also to break up. And we'll talk more, and I'm not going to talk too much more, how these things do or don't fit together. The bottom line is that there's a lot of there beneath the surface. There's extraordinary stress and strain, which everyone in this room knows, and the happy picture that the government has put in place where they're trying to make it harder to divorce and ask families to have a second or even third child seems to be operating in a different universe than the citizens. This is another piece which I'll just throw out, and then when the Q&A we'll pick it up, and that's the distinction between men and women. I mentioned in the study of the Marriage Corner with the parents, and then when we ran it against the survey where we had the information on how individuals found a partner, that there was something quite different between what men were expecting of marriage and how they went to get found a partner versus women. Sometimes they're the same, but something is clearly gendered. And this was a survey that was online this summer, and it shows the dark blue are the females, and in each case, women are less likely than men to think that they can commit to one romantic partner for life. So this is the men. Yes, I absolutely can imagine this is true. Only 30% of women are going to say, yes, absolutely true. And then we go here, not sure, women are more unsure. This is just capturing people on an online survey. It is not as good as the Shanghai survey that we had, but to me, it reflects what I do see in many different ways, that men and women are increasingly looking at marriage in a different way. And this has been true for a long time, but here, and this is why I call it his, her, and their marriages. So the idea that marriages experienced differently for men and women is true. But the curious or the distinctive aspect about the Chinese experience that we've been able to track is before 1949, there were his, her, and their marriages. Daughters were in a very different position than sons. Daughters were married out. Virtually all women were married. 15% of men were not married. And marriages were controlled and orchestrated by parents. So there was his opportunity, her opportunity, and theirs, the parents. So the idea of his, her, and their marriages is a well-established, I think, phenomena before 1949. The socialist revolution, particularly in the cities, really drastically changed that. And what we could see by the 70s from indirect, and because we don't have great surveys from those eras, were that in the cities where socialism was most institutionalized, men and women really, first of all, the age at marriage, the age difference between men and women narrowed. So that meant women were more likely to marry men who were their peers. Then we thought about housing. Most people in urban China went to the Danwei, lined up, waited in line, and eventually they got an apartment. Their parents, for most people, couldn't push them up the queue. In fact, you stayed with your parents if you weren't allocated a dorm room until your name came up on the queue. And this is, of course, very different than rural China. So for most people in China where parents controlled housing, it was a different story. I think that wasn't the full socialist revolution. But if we look at the Danwei system and the socialist economy that was built with decommodified housing, parents really lost access. Parents also lost the ability to help find a mate. Most people who did use introductions, and they were very common in the Mao years, it was someone at the workplace. It was their shifu and in the Chejian, or if they were, or in the school, it would be the banjuren, the people that were supervising these young adults, and those were the people who found the best matches. It wasn't the parents. The parents didn't have that oversight, they didn't have that influence, and they didn't have the assets. So what I'm hypothesizing is in that socialist era, marriages became more egalitarian. There was more sharing of housework. We don't know if there was less domestic violence. I'm going to put that aside. And I can refer you to other people who are now focused on what they perceive as an increased level of violence. I have no idea if it was less in the 1960s or 70s, but I am quite sure that the way in which people found their mate, the narrow age gap, and then the character of the welfare system meant that marriages were more egalitarian. And the last point, they were politicized so that if you stepped out of line, were you to be unfaithful to your partner, this would get you in deep trouble. And there was not as much privacy. And it was not that there weren't affairs, not that people didn't act out, but it was much more costly. And so people had, as reported, less of the kind of cheating that this survey seems to indicate is quite common. Okay, and that's my point. It's been the case, his, her, and their marriages, except for this interlude, the Maoist interlude. I just want to quickly, this is the lecture part. Not necessary, but since I was introduced as the faculty member, I will quickly go over this and remind you. What did the state do in the past? I started with this picture of now the state wants to redefine what marriage is. They want to up fertility. They want to make it harder to marry. They want to make it cheaper to marry. That's the goal. And there are many ways in which, since 1979, the government has made very specific interventions. It's not all stepping back. So the 1980 marriage law was very important because it really put no-fault divorce in the front burner, changed some of the wording. And they also, at the same time, took away the jating shenfen, so that in marriage you weren't matching on political purity, and you could marry across political lines. Also, big change, of course, is people could move around, and this is the story for rural people more than urban, although what we know happened in the late 70s and the 90s, many families that had been separated were able to reunite. So these allowance of greater freedom to choose your place of residence also impacted what happened. Then we can skip ahead to this is the article, if you want to look at it later, the marriage law in 2001. In response to this surge of divorces, the people, central government leaders, and particularly women in the Women's Federation, wanted to tighten it. And they wanted to rewrite the law to make it harder to get a divorce. They thought if they could make it harder, it would reduce the level. And this sparked a very, very animated debate, which reflected the new China, where people do have private lives, where people are more willing to give the other person an alternative as long as it doesn't impinge on them. And in the end, they did not make it harder to get divorce. Instead, as I'm emphasizing, what happened with these interpretations is they, what I call the triple turn. 2001, 2003, and 2011. The other key, which relates to the first diagram, is 2003. Maybe the younger people in this room can hardly believe it, but until 2003, if you wanted to marry or if you wanted a divorce, you had to go to your employer and get a permission. And this was a huge constraint. Even in a city like Shanghai, where I was doing most of the field work, it was too embarrassing. You would have to go to your, and then if you'd left your unit and you were in private, who are you going to go back to? You have to go back and say, I want a divorce. And in 2003, the Minzhangju changed the rule. And if you go back to the first table that graph, you'll see the spike. It really accelerates. Okay. So those are it, but they have unanticipated consequences. In the one-child policy, what they're basically doing is separating sexuality and fertility, as I've argued. And the state wants to control the population, the fertility of the population, but not the sexual behavior of the participants. So when they move in that direction, you end up really stimulating what we in a shorthand will call the sexual revolution. Then, right by removing fault from divorce, they loosened the constraints on divorce by eliminating the need for the employer or the village head to give you permission to divorce, further revolutionized divorce, and by depoliticizing marriage life and reducing supervision, they weaken the stigma of non-marital sexual intimacy. And then talk about the triple turn. And by treating marriage as a contract between willing partners with individual property rights, like other contracts, they threw out this long-established practice of protecting conjugal property. And if there's time or afterwards, those of you who are in the legal field, I'm really, really interested to hear your view. Between 1953 and really I would say the end of the 80s, the Chinese government systematically stood on the side of communal conjugal property, so that this meant particularly for rural women, particularly rural women who are widowed, they didn't have to have bought the house. Their parents didn't have to have bought the house. Their name didn't have to occur on any document. Instead, by being the woman who built the family, made the family, it was her home. And when she died, when her husband died, if her husband died before her, his siblings and relatives could not seize the house. So this was a major, major gain for rural women, that by being the wife in this home that they had built, it was hers. And what these series of legal decisions since 2001 has moved it to what we call formal versus substantive equality. So that now the rule, as many of you know, is if the house that one lives in, and this is particularly in the cities, but it's increasingly in these more urbanized rural areas, is in the name of the son at the time before his marriage, it's his house. And that's it. It's his house. He can decide to add the wife's name, but that's rather rare. And very few women or women's families are willing to ask that the daughter's name be be added to a deed. Then there goes, if there is a divorce and the parents didn't necessarily give it outright as a gift to the son, but they invested in it, at the time of divorce, it will be allocated to people in proportion to the amount that they invested in the home. So you can have the situation in which the wife has no claim to her home, but her in-laws have a claim to it because they're the ones who paid the most. And this was institutionally is one of the things that I find most important, that these various steps by the reforming, opening and reform government, particularly since 2011, have moved really very extreme position of making home ownership, which is so much at the core of the marital agreement and the marital home, something that is highly individualized, not only privatized, but individualized. And this goes against not only what the Chinese government tried to do so systematically between 53 and really the end of the 80s, but it also is in contrast to what we see in other parts of the world, where a recognition of communal property, that is, by virtue of living in it and making it your home, you have rights to it. And it could be for men or women. And China's moving away from that in this arena, going to something that's quite legalistic. And we can talk more about that. So right now, are they going to turn back the clock? That picture that I showed you at the beginning, the civil code now requires a cooling off period. In 2021, as we know, they now are allowing, even encouraging, a third birth. In 2022, Ma Baoli, that's Blued, the gay dating site, he stepped down as the CEO, and Blued has now been delisted. This is one of many ways in which we can see a tolerance be eroded, say. And then this last one, which is about surrogacy, which is part of this discussion, and how the government has now decided that surrogacy is something, or artificial, different kinds of interventions will be legal and will be covered for insurance, although not for single women who want to freeze their eggs. That decision was reaffirmed last July. So they still are standing on the side of assisted reproduction only for married couples. And then this last one, which I flagged, the government hoping to raise birth rate. So can these behaviors be reversed? This is the book, what I called the triple turn. Can they really turn away from marriage as a voluntary contract between two consenting adults? Can they return to closer surveillance of sexual intimacy and controls over marital fertility? And can they move to a greater legal protection of communal conjugal property? And those are the three questions. Can they put the genie back in the bottle? This is a picture from the Minzhongbu, which was in Shanghai in September of this year. The happy couple who have announced they're at the marriage registry. I also went to the marriage registry, I think it was 50 times, and watched what was going on there. I don't think so. This is quickly, and then, because you do want the Q&A to start in 2 minutes. This is from a surveys done in 2010 and 2015 on cohabitation. And you can see that in the period, this is the birth year. So these are the people born in 1940. Cohabitation among those who are married in that survey is very low, and it goes up, up. It's not that it didn't exist, but we're talking 5%. And now it's up to about 30%. And in some place I don't know, in Beijing, because I haven't spent as much time here, in Shanghai, I would say it's the norm, that couples who are planning to marry will cohabit. And it's widely accepted. There's also increased cohabitation, which isn't even a step towards marriage, but seen as acceptable in young adult life. When I showed this slide to the students at Sushimin, they immediately said, "Where's the control for cost of housing?" They said, maybe this has nothing to do with a sexual revolution. Maybe that's just about high cost of housing. I am sure that the high cost of housing has an impact, but I don't think that's what's driving people's decision to cohabit before marriage. I may be wrong. That's a hypothesis to test. But that was their response. The last table response is a thing on this, which many of you mentioned, which is, can China raise its birth rate? And this shows you what's happening in the rest of East Asia. This is now. Below 2 is below replacement fertility, and China has been below replacement since 1995. So China is one of many East Asian societies which has what we call sub-replacement fertility. And it's very low, and it's persistent, and they don't think it's going to change. And I don't think that this kind of effort by the government to increase the third births is going to shake the TFR above that line. So will there be a more protection of the communal property? This is an open question, and many of you in the audience, either tonight or maybe you'll send me an email, can give me a sense of whether you think the state will move in that direction to try to move away from this obsession with whose name is on the deed, who gave what percentage of the initial price came from which party. I will say that there are, because in the urban areas, half of the parents have a daughter, that it's not simply the case that this is always that the man is the one who has the greater claims. That's really a rural issue. In the cities, it's much more equal. And many women who are only daughters already have a claim to property that will be theirs. And the increase in premarital contracts, what I've observed these last 10 years, is driven primarily by parents, and particularly parents of daughters, who want the family property to remain with their daughter and not be under the control of another family. So will there be a new culture? That's where we'll leave it.